Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. In this episode, recorded on May 27th, 2014, Daniel and I conclude our conversation with Dr. Ivan Eland about his 2008 book, Recarving Rushmore, ranking the presidents on peace, prosperity, and liberty. Dr. Eland is Senior Fellow and Director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute, and previously served as Director of Defense Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. He has written articles for many different publications and has appeared on numerous television programs, including ABC's World News Tonight and CNN's Crossfire. You can follow his work at Ivan_Eland on Twitter. That's Ivan_ELAND, and through his archives on the Independent Institute's website, which is independent.org, antiwar.com, and the Huffington Post. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/presidents-2.
So let's talk about Harding and Coolidge. So Harding is number 6 and Coolidge is number 10. Why does Harding place above Coolidge? And why do they both do pretty well? I believe they both got okay or good rankings.
Yeah, they were good. They weren't in the great category, but they were good. And the reason that they were is because they're sort of proto-libertarian presidents in that they were. I actually probably call them more traditional conservatives as opposed to the type of conservatives that we have nowadays, which I would consider more big government conservatives and more prone to warfare than back in those days. But Harding and Coolidge, they actually reduced the size of government after the World War below what it was before the war. And that's the only time that's ever been done in U.S. history. And it's very rare, I think, in world history. Wars usually create big government, and the ratchet effect keeps the government big even during peacetime. A lot of these measures during wartime, even economic ones and domestic ones, hang over into the peace time after the war is over. Now, Harding and Coolidge both reduced the size of government from the war, and of course they also dramatically reduced. They didn't completely eliminate foreign intervention because we're intervening in Latin America a little bit during their presidencies, but I think they almost did everything the opposite of Wilson, and of course that gets points in my book since Wilson is the worst. But he was the most interventionist president probably in foreign affairs in U.S. history, and of course they toned that down a great deal. And I think Harding gets more credit. Harding is often tainted by these scandals, none of which he really had any personal role in, and also he's tainted by some of his, probably even more so when his legacy was being created back in the 20s after he died. He was tainted by these allegations that he had affairs with at least 2 women and maybe more. I regard those nowadays as personal scandals. I didn't really dock Clinton too much for his personal scandal, and probably even less for Harding. But I mean, the political scandals are fair game, I think, and these were graft scandals, corruption scandals, and of course that's bad. You don't want to have people in your administration pocketing the taxpayers' money. But I would say that both Harding's and Grant's, which were the same type of corruption scandals, pale in comparison to the seriousness of constitutional scandals like Watergate and Iran-Contra. And I think, so the scandals for Harding are overrated, and I think he was probably a little more free market than Coolidge, although Coolidge was very good as well. They're both in the category of good presidents, and Coolidge, I give a high rating toward setting either good or bad precedents. Well, high rating for setting good precedents, lower rating for setting bad precedents. And Harding set some good precedents, and Coolidge followed up on those, I think. And they're virtually the only time the Republican Party, probably in its history, except for maybe Rutherford B. Hayes and Chester Arthur in the 19th century, it's really the only time that the Republican Party has been for small government, because from Eisenhower on, Democratic presidents have reduced spending more than Republican presidents have. And they have a better record on spending and deficits than the Republicans do, surprisingly.
Okay, so how did Harding's handling of the Depression of 1920 and 21 play in, where the federal budget shrunk dramatically? So how did that play in, and how did the expansion of the monetary policy play into this that ultimately factored into the Great Depression?
Well, I think I did dock Coolidge a little bit there. I looked at the money supply during that period, and Coolidge started increasing it some, and I think that has to be considered. Harding has a pretty good record on the monetary policy, so you can't really blame him for any of the depression. Coolidge, you may be able to blame a little bit for some of his monetary increases. Now, as far as Harding's dealing with the depression, the post-war depression, which was induced by the war, it was, conservatives today would like how he did that, and that is he reduced government spending. He said, we're not going to have this bonus bill for the veterans. The states are already doing lots of stuff for the veterans, and the federal government was doing some stuff as well, and they wanted a big bonus. So that was one of the things. It was a very popular program, and it was going to bust the budget. And he said, no, we're reducing the budget. And I think that really brought back economic confidence, and of course it also freed up resources that had been used by the government during the war back into the economy. And so I think that's the way to deal with it. And if George W. Bush and Obama had done the same thing after the crisis in 2008, the economic collapse, but they took, of course, the Keynesian approach to spend, stimulate, bail out their way back to prosperity. And you see this drag, this weak recovery that we have. And Harding turned the economy around pretty quickly, I think, by doing what seems counterintuitive nowadays. So I think that can be a lesson. It should have been the lesson that they used in 2008, but it was not, unfortunately.
It seems like it's all but forgotten now, unfortunately.
So it is. I think, people like Amity Schleys, when she wrote the Coolidge book, she, touted those types of policies, and she's trying to bring them back. I'm trying to do a bit of that here, although I don't just focus on Harding and Coolidge in my book, but certainly I think those policies we should use that as a model, really.
Okay. Now, looking at the two presidents that followed them, a lot of people seem to have this idea that Hoover was a proponent of capitalism, of laissez-faire capitalism and free markets. Now, you have him 18 and you have FDR 31st. What's wrong with that idea about Hoover, and then why does FDR rank even lower when it could be said on many levels that FDR's New Deal was continuing and extrapolating from many of Hoover's programs?
Well, I think, first of all, Hoover, it was a progressive Republican. He was not he's criticized now because he did less than FDR, and but at the time he was much more progressive than Harding and Coolidge, and more akin to Teddy Roosevelt, I think. And so he's the one that started down the road. He did set some of the precedents for Roosevelt later on, but I think Roosevelt's expansion was so great compared to Hoover. There's certainly, I would call it a Hoover, if you're lumping Calvin, Coolidge, and Harding together. They were from the same party. People do that all the time since Coolidge took over for Harding. But I would also, as a group of presidents, I would lump Hoover and FDR. But I think FDR also, I downgraded him. Hoover was very good on the intervention, the foreign intervention, I think. And FDR, of course, was salivating to get into World War II, so much so that he put an embargo against the Japanese, and he knew he was basically trying to strangle the Japanese from oil. And of course, that led to the invasion or the attack on Pearl Harbor, because they had to go get the oil because the U.S. wouldn't sell it to them. They had to go to Indonesia to get it. They had to go past the Philippines, and of course, that was a U.S. colony with military forces on it. And so they attacked the Philippines and Pearl Harbor mainly out of desperation. And of course, FDR refused to negotiate with the Japanese prime minister, because I think he may have wanted a backdoor into the war in Europe. And he also felt that the Munich 1938 problem, he didn't want to appease the Japanese. So the Munich 1938 problem was already causing a problem, this syndrome was already causing a problem. But I think many of his wartime actions, of course, going to war with Germany before Pearl Harbor in the Atlantic, we were at war with Germany. And of course, even before that, he was helping out with Lend-Lease, the Allies, and the destroyer deal, which was totally unconstitutional. So I rate FDR a little lower than Hoover simply because I think his actions were, even if you agree with World War II, say World War I is a given, there's in a republic we really need to get we shouldn't be dragging the country secretly into war, and I think FDR did that. So I think he gets lowered for that as well as the economic New Deal.
So we have Jimmy Carter on your list and Ronald Reagan, and I know a lot of conservatives nowadays praise Ronald Reagan a lot and do not like Jimmy Carter nearly as much. Carter, however, ranks 8th, and Reagan gets 34. So there's a very large difference in those rankings, even though they're right beside each other in history. So why is there that huge gap?
Well, I think you get some surprising results when you get past the images. And we all have images of Thomas Jefferson or Lincoln or Washington or Reagan, and particularly conservatives and some libertarians have a image of Reagan, which is not really based in fact. I have 3 major problems with Reagan. The first one is he did not reduce the size of government. Clinton and Eisenhower, in that order, are the champions budget cutters after Truman. I don't count Truman because he was reducing the budget. 40-some% of the GDP in World War II was government because it was such an abnormal event. So I don't count Truman. He had nowhere to go but down. But if you go from Eisenhower on, Clinton and Eisenhower reduced the budget more than any other president. Ronald Reagan increased the budget, not only the raw budget, which is easy to do in Washington, but budget as a percentage of GDP. So that's one. Number 2, we have the Iran-Contra scandal, which I think was the worst political scandal in American history, even worse than Watergate, because they ran a secret war. And Congress had prohibited them from doing that. So they circumvented Congress's appropriation power, which really goes to the center, the heart of the Constitution, and what remaining power that Congress has left, it has through the purse, and they were eroding that. Congress no longer has the power to declare war because that's been usurped by the president, et cetera, et cetera. Congress doesn't have that much power left, and Reagan was going after it. Also, his signing statements when he wasn't enforcing congressionally mandated laws. But that was a more minor thing. And the third one, of course, is he almost started a nuclear war in 1983. And most people don't know this because of his harsh rhetoric against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, Yuri Andropov, the Soviet leader at the time, became very scared that the U.S. was actually going to do a first strike on the Soviets. And the Soviets, whenever they would go into Hungary or Czech Republic or whatever, they would start up a military exercise and then invade, because everyone was lulled to sleep. Oh, this is an exercise. So, of course, the Soviets were projecting a little bit, but nonetheless, Reagan's harsh rhetoric came together with this Able Archer nuclear command and control exercise that NATO was doing in November of 1983. And the Soviets raised their alert forces, and Yuri Andropov had created a whole new intelligence unit because he was really scared that the U.S. was going to come out of this exercise and just launch a full-blown attack on the USSR. So I think Reagan, by that, the overall U.S.-Russian or U.S.-Soviet relations has always been much more important than warhead counts as to whether you're going to have an accidental nuclear war. And that's during Clinton, they also had a problem. The Soviet missile defenses and I don't want to say defenses, but missile warning system was decrepit after the Cold War had ended. But the relations were very good between Yeltsin and Clinton. And so the Soviets got a wrong reading from a Norwegian rocket that was sent up, and they thought there was going to be a nuclear war. The U.S., their screens had all these missiles coming in, triggered by this one Norwegian scientific rocket. But of course, the atmosphere was very good, and so the there was really no chance of nuclear war. In 1983, when Reagan did this, of course, it was the height of the Cold War, and it was a very dangerous situation. So I think even Reagan's later arms control talks, which weren't really that significant, the agreement that he got wasn't really that significant. I think it was paled in comparison to this incident, which could have ended up, it's the second worst nuclear incident since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and being the first, of course. And so I think those three things are a wrap on Reagan. The other thing is Carter, he wasn't bad on the budget. He deregulated 4 major industries, and he and Ford, Gerald Ford, his predecessor, of the recent presidents, were by far the least interventionist of any presidents. And so he gets credit on that side. And I think he gets a lot less credit than he should. And I think the party label is a problem here, because Ronald Reagan's image was spruced up by Grover Norquist and other people to use against Clinton in the 90s. So Reagan became this demigod. But if you go back into the 80s when Reagan was president, conservatives were howling over the INF Treaty, which they thought that was giving away the store to the Soviet Union, et cetera. So Reagan wasn't, and Reagan saved Social Security by raising the payroll tax. He wasn't for getting rid of it. So there's all sorts of different things. Even Reagan's tax cuts, of all the Republicans in the post-war era, Reagan's tax cuts were actually the smallest as a per capita, as a percentage of GDP of all the Republican presidents. So, and that's because his tax cuts were essentially fraudulent. He reduced taxes, but he increased spending, and therefore he increased the deficits. And of course, he was increasing the debt at a huge rate. And so if you don't cut spending, then you either have to raise taxes or you have to expand money supply, etc. And of course, he did raise taxes several times surreptitiously later on. So his net tax increases weren't as great as his initial rate cuts in 1981 would indicate.
Now, you had Carter at 8th, and right behind him was Eisenhower at 9th. Why does Eisenhower fare so well, and why does his successor, Kennedy, who seems to be a much more beloved figure in the present day, come out so poorly at 35th?
Well, first of all, Kennedy is the big problem. Same thing I have with Ronald Reagan. I mean, he had the number one incident which came closest to incinerating the world, and of course that was really unneeded. He even admitted, and his Secretary of Defense admitted in private, that these missiles in Cuba, these Soviet missiles, we didn't have a viable missile defense then, and we don't now. And so what's the difference if they're shot from Cuba or the Soviet Union? You have a few more minutes to get your affairs in order before we all get killed, right? That's what it amounted to. And they came a lot closer than only recently in the last 20 years have we realized that they came even closer to lighting the match, because the Russians had already put in tactical nuclear weapons, and the military. Kennedy does get some points for restraining the military, because the military wanted to invade Cuba. Had they done that, the Russians would have used those tactical nuclear weapons, and it would have probably escalated into a worldwide nuclear conflagration. But that said, Kennedy later admitted that if he never made the speech about saying, well, these do turn out to be nuclear weapons, because he didn't know if they were at the time. If the Soviets have put nuclear weapons, this is a grave, thing. And whenever they use grave, that's a code word for, we're not going to take it anymore, and we're going to do something about it. And he said, if I had never made that speech, I wouldn't have had to do anything about it. And so, of course, strategically, these weapons weren't that, important. In fact, we had nuclear weapons, Jupiter nuclear weapons in Turkey and Italy, which were very close to the Soviet Union and could have hit their territory. So, and of course, those were eventually secretly traded for Soviet missiles in Cuba. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is the big thing against Kennedy. Of course, he also was involved, accelerated the Vietnam conflict. So I would downgrade him for that. Eisenhower was cutting the budget. He believed in the military-industrial complex. He had been in the military as a general, and he knew the dangers there. Where I rate Eisenhower down a little bit was he was excessively enamored with covert operations, but it did keep him out of major wars. He only had one military intervention, and that was the invasion of Lebanon in 1958. The other knock against Eisenhower is he did build up the nuclear weapons to reduce, because nuclear weapons are much cheaper than conventional weapons, and so to reduce the budget, he did that. And in fact, that led to that helped with the nuclear arms race. So I think Eisenhower does have a few debits on his records, and that's why he's lower than Carter. But he's certainly better than Kennedy. And Kennedy was really sort of reckless. He was very competitive, and I think he got himself into the Cuban Missile Crisis and eventually moderated, thank God, but he was really reckless to get started. And of course, we have to go back to why the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred in the first place, and that was the U.S. had done the Bay of Pigs, sponsored guerrillas, anti-communist guerrillas, to overthrow Castro. Well, of course, Castro wanted protection after that, and they knew that the Kennedy brothers, after that fiasco, unbelievably, they were still plotting to overthrow Castro. So that's one of the reasons, and probably the major reason, that the Soviets put the nuclear weapons in there in the first place, was to defend Cuba from the United States invasion. And so the one thing led to the next. The Bay of Pigs led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this reckless behavior on the part of Kennedy was very bad. Kennedy did cut taxes, however, but it was more of a Keynesian type cut to get people to spend more rather than to help the supply side. But anyway, it was a tax cut, and so he does get credit for that. But he usually gets credit for the Civil Rights Act, but Lyndon Johnson actually really got that through after Kennedy's death. So I think his legislative accomplishments were very meager. He wasn't very good at getting things through Congress, and he also almost incinerated the world.
How did the interstate highway system factor into Eisenhower's ranking?
Well, of course, that dropped because this is one of the biggest public works programs in the U.S. history. Of course, Eisenhower still managed to reduce the budget after that. So I suppose you can argue that if you're going to spend on government stuff, infrastructure, is better than most. But certainly in the 1800s, we had private roads, and who knows? We may have gotten something close to that just by letting states do this instead of doing a federal mandate. But I didn't give Eisenhower, I docked him for that because it was a major program, infrastructure program or public works program.
So I'm very interested to see where, if you could, tell us where the current president ranks in your new ranking, or are you not allowed to say that until the release in the fall?
Well, I think he's like 34th out of 41st, so that's pretty low. However, I would say I think he's better than Bush because he has been a little bit better than Bush in foreign policy and reserve, and he's marginally better in civil liberties than Bush. But of course, in both of those cases, it wouldn't be hard to be better than Bush. But he's still quite low. He may even have a better budgetary record than Bush in the end because he's, the deficit is coming down and spending has actually decreased. Now, of course, now that they've taken the sequester off, we don't know what's going to happen. So that you have to have a caveat by that. But of course, the sequestration was Obama's idea, and he really wasn't thrilled about it. But he did sign the bill, so I think he has to be given some credit for the government reduction there. But of course, he did nationalizations of car companies, and the stimulus, which was over $1 trillion when you added it all up, because it came in a couple of different tranches. And a lot of that was just, green energy, which wasn't ready for prime time. And, it was just pork barrel stuff. And he was going according to the Keynesian model that you spend your way out of. And of course, we see what kind of a weak recovery we have. So certainly, Obama is not very favorable.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.